Welcome to a new episode of my 7 Advanced Tips series. Today we're covering Xilonen. I don't like long intros, so let me just say one thing. In these videos I assume you already have the basics of a character so that we can jump into more advanced topics right away. But if you are unsure on how Xilonen works, my early access video is still relevant and covers the basics and a general meta talk. So what can ever be so advanced about such a simple character? Skill into normals and you're already given access to her Rest Shred, and with a simple Crystallize you also activate the new support Natran set. But what if I'm playing two different elements? What if I'm playing Arlecchino with Yelan, or Wriothesley with Xilonen, or maybe Electrocharged? Surely the Rest Shred is the most important part of her kit and that's guaranteed, but buffing multiple elements with the scroll set is definitely not. And a lot of people are making a mistake here, and they don't even realize it. So for the first tip, let's make the example of an apparently unlikely to rerun character. But don't worry, I will cover many others as well. Wriothesley applies Cryo, Xilonen to Bennett and Xilonen. This is probably what most people would do. And it works, but maybe we can make it better. We're giving Wriothesley 40% cryo damage, but we're not giving Xilonen 40% pyro damage. So how do we do that? And this is where Xilonen can become harder to play and starts having way more depth. If Anemo units are able to double swirl to buff multiple elements, then Xilonen is able to double Crystallize to achieve the same. But the setups are way different, because while many Anemo units are able to spread or reapply elements, Crystallize does nothing but consume a bit of the aura it is interacting with. So I've seen people do setups like apply element 1, Crystallize with Yelan Burst, apply element 2, Crystallize with Xilonen skill. Or I've also seen people discussing burst skill to normals or skill to normals burst. And all of these are super okay, just not as complete. The scroll set full effect is activated only if she is in her Night Soul Blessing state. So using her burst before the skill or after the two normals will only grant a 12% damage bonus on that specific cast. So you would think of using the burst during your skill to get the full effect. But here's another issue when wanting to buff two elements. You need your skill cast to trigger a Crystallize, and without switching, the enemy needs to have a new element applied to them so that you can Crystallize that one as well. That's pretty hard to do already, and we're not even considering the fact that Crystallize has a 1 second global cooldown for each enemy. This is the reason why her skill into normals only trigger one Crystallize, so we also have to avoid that. But let's get more practical. If some Anemo units are able to Guoba Swirl, let me tell you that Xilonen can Guoba Crystallize. Well, kind of. We can apply a small amount of Hydro, a Tartaglia normal attack, or a Yelan skill. Drop Guoba, Xilonen skill, normal attack, burst, normal attack. This gives you both 40% pyro and 40% Hydro damage. Or let's go back to the Wriothesley team. Wriothesley normal attack, drop Guoba, Xilonen skill, normal, burst, normal. There you go. You have 40% pyro, 40% cryo damage, both for 15 seconds, and we didn't waste a single second inside Bennett's burst. We can now simply cast what we need and go to Wriothesley. At the end of the rotation, we either burst or spend a bit of time on Wriothesley to make sure there is a cryo aura to restart the rotation. This works because it allows us to get a Crystallize before Guoba's attack, which will erase the cryo aura right after, and then during our burst establish a pyro one. In Vaporite teams instead it works because Crystallize consumes a bit of the aura, helping Guoba remove it all. Technically, you can use this setup for a multitude of national-like teams, or Emeltganu, Rosaria, and who knows, maybe Silali. And by the way, you can also do skill, burst, two normals on Xilonen, it achieves the same. As you can see, it's not as easy, and here it's very dependent on the fact that Guoba has no internal cooldown on his attacks. So what if it's a team without the Stove God? Arlecchino with Yelan, for example, is maybe one of the most played Vaporite teams nowadays. Let's see a rotation. Arlecchino skill, Xilonen skill, two normals, Yelan, Bennett, Arlecchino. But what is the double Crystallize? While researching and testing rotations for this video, I realized that while doable, not always it's something you should be going for. Arlecchino does such a big portion of total steam damage that it wouldn't really matter, and making sure she is the one getting all the buffs is the most important thing. But if you want to get nerdy with me for a second, here's one way I achieved an Arlecchino Yelan setup. We start with Arlecchino skill, Yelan Burst skill, Bennett skill, burst. It's important that you follow the order here. We are on a Pyro Aura, which can be used by Xilonen's skill to Crystallize. We normal attack once, no more Pyro Aura, and here it gets nasty. You wait for a very brief time, then start an attack but cancel it with your burst, so the Yelan is triggered but Xilonen's skill doesn't expire. Burst will now trigger the Hydro Crystallize. We finish with the actual second normal attack, and that's it. Both elements are crystallized and buffed by 40% damage. But not only this is hard to do, we're also wasting time on Bennett Burst. And there is a setup that also avoids that. I'll just link it in the description below, together with a few more I tested. But as I said, I don't think it's necessary to try this rotation specifically for Arlecchino. And if you don't want to bother with any of this, and if you have Kazuha, this is actually a fantastic team similar to Hyper Carry Novilat teams, and it has no setup issues and great uptime on all the buffs. And lastly, unlike Anemo, all of these double crystallized setups can stay the same in AoE, but otherwise, something much easier to do is also to simply apply one element on one enemy, another on another enemy, and crystallize both. Skill, normal burst normal, will give you AoE Geo even if your skill doesn't hit multiple enemies and also avoids the Crystallize cooldown. This Crystallize cooldown is rather annoying. Every time you think of a setup, you have to think of a way to avoid it. But what if there was a way to ignore it? This is what speedrunners call booking. I'm not gonna stop on this for long, but opening any of the in-game menus or the adventurer's book will pause the entire game except for a few things. One of them is exactly the Crystallize cooldown. The combo where we had to wait, or the one where we have to skill and burst together, can now be caught and totally skip on the burst, for example. You could trigger a Crystallize with her skill and her first attack. If you have ever seen speedruns where the player constantly pauses the game, this is why. It's also a way to instantly catch energy particles. For the next tip, let's talk about something more simple. Xilonen is a very easy to build character, but there are two misconceptions that float around and I want to clear them. Generally, she builds energy recharge and defense, maybe with healing bonus. However, how much energy and healing is necessary varies quite a bit and can low-key be almost ignored, unless we're playing with Furina, where investing into her healing and her energy recharge might be more important. But her energy cost of 60 actually has such an easy time getting covered, and that's because the scroll set, other than the damage buff, also provides 6 energy every time a Night Soul Burst is triggered. And Xilonen has the ability of triggering one Night Soul Burst that won't even trigger its cooldown. So her real energy cost is not 60 but more like 48 or 42. Because of this, to get an easier time with the energy generation, it is recommended to burst before her second normal attack. Although it is possible for her to catch her own particles doing the classic skill to normal burst, it can waste 6 energy. And another misconception is how much defense her signature weapon requires. 3200 defense is the number you need to fully activate its buff. However, there are two things to consider. The weapon itself will further buff you by 16% defense after 2 attacks, and a Night Soul Burst is always happening and gives Xilonen another 20% defense increase. Of course you might want to have more defense anyway, but if you don't want to waste resources min-maxing a character that doesn't need min-maxing, the actual numbers you need are 2889 when 80 out of 90 and 2865. At level 90, you will be guaranteed to be above 3200 with this. And by the way, her weapon snapshots her defense, so even if you do some weird setup or you buff her defense just briefly, know that the buff will stay the same for its duration. For the last tip, I want to actually talk about her consolation too. The thing is, Xilonen is a very popular character that works in many teams and has very good vertical investment options. But I've seen a lot of confusion regarding this constellation, so let's make it simple. When C2, her Geo sample is always activated. This means that even if you don't use Xilonen at all, the Geo buff and the Geo Res Shred are always active, but the buffs are only granted to the character of the corresponding element. An Itto Goro team would give both Itto and Goro 50% damage and Geo Res Shred permanently. However, the others need to be activated. So we simply do her skill plus 2 attacks rotation. This will give each Hydro unit in the team 45% max HP, each Pyro unit 45% attack, and so on. These buffs will stay active for 15 seconds and work even if the character getting them is off field. The Electro one doesn't have a duration, so it can be used every time Xilonen can use her skill. This constellation of course is non-mandatory, and aside from the electro shenanigans, it just makes your overall damage higher, especially for cryo and geo units. It also enables one team you cannot play otherwise, which is triple geo teams. Itogoro Xilonen, for example, is not playable without this constellation because the Geo Rush Red would only be active when on-fielding Xilonen. But hey Seven, what about on-fielding Xilonen? She has clear indication in her kit that she can be a damage dealer. But I have not included a single tip for that, simply because I made an entire video on it, where I cover her best combos and showcase her most viable teams, so if you're interested, you could go check that now. Thank you for watching, leave a like if you enjoyed, and see you in the next video.